I was standing in the kitchen rain, tapping against the window, when my brother slid a folder across the table. "Go ahead. Open it," David said, his voice calm in a way that made my stomach tighten. Inside was a property deed. At the bottom, my father's signature. My name crossed out. David's name neatly typed in its place. The date made my fingers go cold. 2 weeks before our father died. David stood there like a man rehearsing a victory. "It's legal," he said, steady eyes, steady tone, steady knife. The kettle clicked, but didn't boil. The clock in the hallway ticked like it was chewing through the morning. I stared at the page, at the seal, at the way my father's handwriting looked familiar, but tired. "I'll read it," I said, sliding the folder back. "I'll take it to Mr. Harris myself." "You don't need to," David replied. "You only need to sign the acknowledgement. It'll save us both time and trouble." His idea of trouble always meant my idea of loss. The rain grew louder. The window shuddered once. "I'll read it," I repeated. David's shrug said he'd expected this, that this was just his opening move. He walked out of the kitchen without looking back. I stood there until the kettle began to whistle. Let it sing a second longer than necessary, like a train finally arriving after a long journey. I poured tea into one of my father's old mugs, chipped on the handle, stained by years of stories told over late nights. I thought about the hydrangeas in the yard crowding the fence, the way they always had the source of a friendly dispute with our neighbor every spring. I thought about my father in his final weeks, dozing in his armchair by the window, waking with a start, like he'd been halfway to telling me something, and lost it in the dark. The last words he ever said to me came back low and deliberate. "Hold what's yours without gripping. You grip too hard. You break it." I put the folder in the drawer beside the stove, and I stood there, watching the rain, knowing this was just the beginning. People like to pretend that mistrust arrives all at once like a thunderclap. It doesn't. It collects in small, ordinary moments until you realize the jar is full. When David and I were boys, he broke our father's watch. The road trip watch, the one Dad wore whenever he drove past state lines, as if the ring and the watch together could keep him from drifting. We were playing by the creek, daring each other to leap from stone to stone. David slipped, caught himself on the bank, and the watch clattered against the rocks, the crystal webbed with cracks. He looked at me, wide eyes, wet palms, and said, "Tell him it was you." I did. Dad grounded me for a week. David thanked me once quickly, like a man tossing a coin in a jar and walking away before the sound finished. In high school, a scholarship committee called the House. They wanted to confirm the essay was mine. It was, except David had lifted a paragraph, the best paragraph from a story I'd written the year before, and left on the family computer. He said it was an accident, that he had absorbed my words the way brothers absorb each other's clothes. I swallowed the explanation because arguments were expensive back then. We had all learned economy of money, of apologies. Trust didn't break in one day. It frayed. We patched it with family dinners and holiday photographs, with quick jokes and careful silences, but it was never new again. So when David said sign, what I heard was every old moment asking to be repeated. 3 o'clock, sharp, Mr. Harris showed up at the house, rain on his shoulders, leather briefcase in hand, his grey suit pressed like he'd never leaned on anything in his life. Aunt Claire arrived a few minutes later, trailing perfume and the kind of smile that always felt rehearsed. David stayed by the counter arms, folded his posture somewhere between "I've already won" and "I dare you to argue." We sat at the kitchen table, the deed in the center like a loaded gun nobody wanted to touch. Mr. Harris adjusted his glasses. "I'll hold on to this," he said, sliding the folder toward his case. "I'll be verifying the stamp, the signature, and the chain of custody. We won't be rushing this. David's mouth twitched. There's nothing to verify, he said flatly. It's signed, sealed, done. Aunt Claire touched his wrist as subtle warning. Let Mr. Harris do his job, she said sweetly. It'll only confirm what we already know. Steam rose from the kettle in the background, curling into the space between us. My father wrote me a letter, I said quietly, and he told me the decision would be mine, not yours. Aunt Claire laughed the kind of laugh you'd use to wave away a child's question. Oh, sweetheart, men write all sorts of sentimental things when they know their time is short. It doesn't mean Mr. Harris interrupted. He also executed a second will, he said, his tone even almost surgical. Witnessed. Notarized. Dated after the deed David presented. David's head snapped towards him. You're kidding. I don't joke about legal documents, Harris replied. Then show it, David demanded. In time, Harris said calmly, closing his case. Until then, no one signs anything, no one moves anything, and no one declares victory. Aunt Claire's rings clicked against her coffee cup. Authentication, she said lightly. Such a heavy word for such a simple matter. Simple matters, Harris replied. Meeting her gaze are the ones people ruin by hurrying. David pushed his chair back hard enough to make the floor complain. I took care of him, he said, voice rising. Day in, day out! I earned that house. I stood too, not to intimidate him, just to meet him at eye level. You don't earn a person, I said. You love them. Or you don't. The hall clock gave one long tick. Harris broke the silence. I'll call you both by Friday, he said. Until then, try to breathe. They left the door clicking shut behind them. The house seemed to exhale. Mrs. Grant appeared in the doorway, a dish towel in her hands. You need to eat something, she said gently. An empty plate makes for a clouded mind. I nodded, but the only thing I could taste was the metallic edge of what was coming. Friday came heavy with low clouds and the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. I was in my father's study, the room that still carried his scent of old books and pipe tobacco, when I found it. The desk drawers were always neat, everything squared to the edge like he'd measured it with a ruler. But the second drawer on the left stuck, just like it had when I was a kid. I pulled once, twice. Then it gave way with a tired groan. Inside was an old brass key. The kind you don't see much anymore, weighty, stubborn, with a single notch near the head. It didn't belong to the safe deposit box at the bank, and it sure didn't fit the file cabinet in the corner. I turned it in my hand, feeling the cool metal warm against my skin, and I remembered my father's quiet habit of hiding important things in plain sight. Mrs. Grant found me there, looking for something she asked. Maybe I said, showing her the key. Her eyes lingered on it for just a second too long before she shook her head. Some locks, she said softly, open more than doors. That night, while the house slept, I walked the hall and felt the boards creak beneath my feet, the same boards that had carried my father through decades of storms and winters. In the far corner of the study behind the bookcase, I found it a narrow panel with a keyhole almost hidden by shadow. The brass key slid in smoothly, a soft click, then the panel opened just enough for my hand to slip through. Inside was a shallow wooden box worn at the corners. On top lay an envelope with Mr. Harris written in my father's handwriting. Beneath it, another envelope with my name. I took the second envelope and sat at the desk before opening it. The paper was thick, folded once the edges slightly frayed. It smelled faintly of cedar the way our closets did in winter, and of the room itself. Dust, lemon oil, the clean bite of ink that had dried a week too soon. My father's pen always left a tiny blot at the start of a line impatience distilled into a dot. This letter had those dots, little heartbeats at the edge of sentences. If you're reading this, I ran out of mornings. I wanted the hard talk face to face, but I wasted too many afternoons believing we'd have one more. I chose what to hold on to and what to hold lightly. Forgive me for what I couldn't finish, and for what I held too tightly when I should have let it breathe. I paused, not because the words were complicated, but because they were simple in a way that hurt. The desk pressed a groove into my forearms. The old chair creaked, like it remembered our arguments. "Do you remember the winter you learned to drive?" he wrote. "Your hands on the wheel were fists. You kept the car between the lines by force. I told you to loosen your grip, and you said you didn't trust the road. I said the road doesn't change because you strangle it. You laughed, but you listened. Eventually, you listened. Hold what's yours without gripping. It's true for cars, and for houses, and for sons." There was a short list of instructions. Check the water meter. Call the neighbor about the fence. Don't let the hydrangeas choke the corner. And then more than a list, a map a few inches wide of how he had loved us. Tell David that being there counted even when the medicine did the talking. Tell him I saw the breakfasts he made, the appointments he drove to, the way he stood in the doorway when he was afraid to come in. Tell him love is not the same as proof, and proofs fail when you force them. My throat tightened. I pressed the page flat and kept going. "You both were my choice," he wrote. "Every morning, every night. A house is just weather with walls. I kept it for you because I thought you would keep each other. If you can't, keep the house anyway and try again later." At the bottom, heavier ink, as if he had leaned closer to make sure I would not miss it. "The house is yours to keep or to leave. Your choice, not anyone else's. If David is angry, forgive him when you can, and before that do no harm." I read it once like a son and once like a stranger. The second time hurt more, the third time steadied me. The fourth time I felt something unclench. Not peace, not yet, just room for it. I put the letter back in the envelope, slid the envelope back into the box, and breathed until the room stopped narrowing. Then I opened the other envelope, the one addressed to Mr. Harris, and did not read it. I sealed it again along the rough flap, the way you press a wound closed before the doctor arrives. The box went back behind the panel. The key stayed in my pocket. My father's words stayed in my hands, warm like a small animal that trusted me to hold without gripping. The next morning, David was waiting in the hallway. He didn't ask what I'd been doing, just stared at me like he was trying to read the part of me that wouldn't speak. "Mr. Harris called," he said. "He wants us both in his office Monday." His tone made Monday sound like a firing squad. We drove in separate cars because some distances are useful. Mr. Harris's office smelled faintly of leather and rain-soaked wool when I stepped inside. David was already there, sitting stiff in a chair across from the desk, his jaw set like he'd been holding it that way for hours. Aunt Claire sat beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes flicking over me like I was a page she'd already read. On the desk, Harris had laid out a row of documents, my father's signatures, spanning 20 years. Next to them was the deed David had shoved at me, and beside that, a single page in a protective sleeve. "The second will," Harris said, tapping the sleeve, "executed 1 week before your father's death. I was present, as was my assistant, and a registered witness. It bequeaths the house to you." He looked directly at me without condition. David let out a short, humorless laugh. "So what, he changed his mind? That's what the deed is for." Harris slid the deed closer, then placed a magnifier over the signature. "Look here," he said to me. "Notice how the pen digs into the page on the first letter, how it stays heavy all the way through. Your father's natural hand didn't do that. It always started firm, then lightened." He swapped the magnifier to the will. This, he continued, is his true hand. No pressure marks beyond the opening stroke. The kind of writing that comes when you're steady, or at least as steady as he could be. Aunt Claire leaned forward. Or maybe she said he was simply tired when he signed the deed. Harris shook his head. Tired changes rhythm, not pressure. This was either guided or forced. David's chair creaked as he leaned back. "Are you accusing me of something I'm saying?" Harris replied, voice cool, "that this document will not survive authentication. The notary who stamped it has vanished. Her license expired last year. Her office is closed. Her phone disconnected. The room went still. Even Aunt Claire didn't have a quick answer for that." Harris closed the folder. "We'll present the second will at the preliminary hearing. You should both prepare for a fight." David stood so abruptly his chair scraped the hardwood. "Withdraw your claim," he said to me low, but sharp. "I'll make it worth your while." I met his eyes. "I'm not interested in your money." His mouth tightened, the color rising in his face. "You'll regret that." I let him walk past me toward the door without a word. Claire followed, pausing only to say, "Families survive when people know when to let go." I waited until they were gone before looking back at Harris. His fingers drummed once on the desk. "They're scared," he said. "That's useful. But don't mistake fear for surrender." Outside, the rain had started again, steady and cold. By the time I reached the gate, the hydrangeas were heavy with water, their blooms bending low, holding on but not breaking. The courthouse hallway smelled like stale coffee and polished wood. David stood with Aunt Claire and his attorney, a man with a perfect haircut and the kind of confidence you can rent by the hour. Inside, the hearing room felt smaller than I expected. The judge was younger, the clock on the wall louder. Mr. Harris started. Calm, measured, he laid out the second will. The clinic records the handwriting analysis. No theatrics, just facts, stacked neatly one atop another. David's lawyer painted a different picture, one where David was the dutiful son, the daily caregiver, the practical choice. He called our objection sentimental. He said I had returned for the harvest, not the planting. It was a clever line meant to sting and to make me look like a tourist in my own life. Harris didn't flinch. He called Mrs. Grant. She took the stand and folded her hands, simple as prayer. Her voice didn't need to rise. She let the room lean in to hear her. She told them about the day my father signed the second will. The window opened, the kettle, whistling, my father reading every line out loud. When he reached the line about the house, she said he paused, smiled, and said, "He'll keep it, or he won't, but he'll decide." She told them about the night of the deed, the unfamiliar car parked out front, the man in a dark coat who wouldn't meet her eyes, my father sleeping so deeply he never heard voices in the kitchen. She did not accuse. She described air and time and the shape of a night. The judge leaned forward. He asked for times, dates, specifics. He asked the nurse from the clinic to confirm the medication log, and she did. On the day of the deed, my father had been given his strongest dose, the one that left him lucid in fragments. David took the stand last. He spoke about the months of care, the long nights, the trips to the pharmacy. It was true mostly, which made it dangerous. He said he had done what I wouldn't. He said the house was his because he had earned it. He said true wish, and his voice caught, just for a moment. Just enough to show the gap where certainty ends and need begins. The judge didn't rule that day. He asked for the notary's ledger if it could be found, and an affidavit from the doctor. He set a second hearing date. He asked us to be patient, as if patience were free and abundant. In the hallway, David brushed past me, his voice low. "You could have stayed," he said. "You could have asked," I replied. We stood there for a breath that felt like a season. We were boys again, the creek, the watch, the borrowed paragraph, except now the cost was written in ink and measured in square feet. Outside the rain had stopped. The hydrangeas at the gate dripped quietly heavy with the weight they'd been holding. That night, I didn't sleep. I walked the rooms the way you walk a border you can't afford to lose. In my father's chair, I read the letter again, slowly, letting each comma be a breath, each ellipsis a mercy. Hold what's yours without gripping. I loosened my hands on the armrests. It felt like a lesson arriving late but intact. The days between hearings were a study in almosts, almost called David, almost threw the deed in the trash, almost drove out of town with the photograph on the passenger seat and the windows down. Mrs. Grant kept the house sane. She filled the fridge with food I forgot to eat. She opened windows when the air was kind and closed them when the weather lied. Once she set a small tin on the table, the kind that used to hold butter cookies, but always held buttons. From your mother, she said. I opened it and found a thimble, 2 chipped marbles, and a note in my mother's handwriting, a grocery list that ended with pick up David after practice. The date was the year she got sick. I sat there with the list for a long time, the way you sit with a song you didn't know you remembered. On Sunday, Aunt Claire came over with a casserole and a fresh strategy. She found me on the porch looking at the hydrangeas like they might tell me the future. You can still fix this, she said, voice soft as velvet over stone. Sell the house to David. Take the money, get out of town, start new. I don't want new, I said. I want honest. Honest is what people say when they can afford to lose, she said. I turned to face her. And what do people say when they can't? She didn't answer the question I asked. She never did. She touched my arm and said, don't be the kind of man who clings to a story and calls it duty. After she left, I wrote another list on the back of my father's letter. Not instructions, just promises I might be able to keep. I will not sign a lie. I will forgive when I can. I will not confuse mercy with weakness. I will keep the window open when the house needs air. The second hearing began without ceremony. No gavel crack, no gasps from the gallery, just the scrape of chairs, the shuffle of papers, the low hum of a fluorescent light that had probably been buzzing since the 80s. The notary's ledger was never found. Her office was empty, her phone disconnected, her address leading to nothing but a locked door and dust. The court clerk called it a dead end. Mr. Harris called it a story that didn't want to be told in daylight. The clinic doctor testified next. Calm, clinical, he confirmed what we already knew. On the day of the deed, my father was sedated enough to dull pain and cloud judgment. He answered the defense's questions without decoration. He refused to be dramatic for either side. It made him undeniable. The handwriting expert repeated his earlier findings, patient as stone. This will breathe, he said of the second document. This one, he added, pointing to the deed, does not. He explained pressure the way a music teacher explains timing, not as a theory, but as a feel. You could see the judge learning the rhythm of a signature as if it were a song he had almost forgotten. Harris handed up the authenticated will, signed in my father's true hand, witnessed, notarized, clear. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The judge took his time. He acknowledged David's months of care. He acknowledged the weight of that work and the loyalty it suggested. He acknowledged, too, the danger of confusing effort with entitlement. Then he did the only honest thing left to do. He set the deed aside as unreliable. He upheld the second will. The house and everything in it was mine. The room did not cheer. It breathed the way a place breathes when a storm moves on without wrecking the roof. David didn't look at me when it was over. Aunt Claire leaned in to whisper something to him, her words lost to the shuffle of people leaving. "Mister." Harris shook my hand like a man who prefers quiet victories. Mrs. Grant touched my shoulder quick and sure, like an anchor you can carry in your pocket. Outside, the air was clean in the way it only is after rain. The courthouse steps gleamed. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once and decided it had said enough. We walked home slowly the way you walk through a house you love, for the first time and the last time. At the gate, the hydrangeas leaned heavy over the fence. "Too close to the line," I said out of habit. "Then teach them the line," Mrs. Grant said, "without breaking them." That evening, David came by. He stayed on the porch, one hand resting on the railing. We looked at each other through the screen door, thin wire thick history. "I won't apologize," he said. "I did what I thought I had to. I won't hate you," I said, "but I won't forget." He nodded once, like a man agreeing with a version of himself he hadn't met yet. "Take care of the place," he said. "I will." He stood there for another second, a boy who used to borrow my jacket and never return it, a man who had measured love in miles driven and pills counted. Then he turned and walked down the steps without looking back. Later I found my father's ring in the desk drawer, the one where he kept maps and old receipts. I turned it in my hand before slipping it on. It fit not perfectly, but well enough. Most inheritances do. I walked through the rooms, touching the edges of furniture, tracing the grain in the wood banister, stopping in the study to open the window. The cool air slid in, carrying the faint smell of rain. The chair by the window remembered my weight. The desk remembered my father's elbows. Small things survive. On the desk sat the photograph my mother holding me on the porch, my father turning toward us with that almost smile. On the back in faded ink, one word, forgiveness. I set it where I would see it every morning and every night. I boiled water, even though I wasn't thirsty. The kettle sang, and I let it sing a little longer than necessary. I thought of the creek, and the watch, and the scholarship, and the ways we fail each other. I thought of the letter and the dots of ink that looked like heartbeats. I thought of my father's last instruction. Not what to keep, but how. I will keep the house for now. I will learn the hydrangeas, the fence, the mercy. I will hold what's mine without gripping. I will let it want me back. And when I cross the street, even now, I feel a ghost of a hand reach for my shoulder. Reflex love memory. It steadies me. It keeps me from breaking what I'm trying to save. It reminds me that some truths arrive late and some arrive right on time when your hands are finally steady enough to carry them. The weak, stretched thin and taut. I tried working through the practical list, the utilities, the insurance, the mail that still arrived with my father's name spelled in a dozen different fonts. Every envelope looked like a stranger who had known him well enough to ask for money. On Tuesday, I drove across town to the pharmacy to ask about the refill schedule. The pharmacist, a woman with grey hair pulled into a practical knot, glanced at the dates and nodded. He was a favourite, she said softly. Polite, even when the pain won. She tapped the screen. On the date you asked about, he needed the stronger dose. We warned about drowsiness. Your brother signed for it. Her eyes flicked up to meet mine. I'm sorry you're walking through this. I thanked her and stepped back into a day that smelled like wet pavement and late summer. At the library, the reference clerk let me scroll through a database that felt older than the building. We didn't find the notary's name anywhere that made sense, just a stale listing on a website that hadn't been updated since the kind of phones people flipped open. The clerk shrugged in that apologetic way librarians do when truth refuses to be filed. Sometimes records go missing, she said. Sometimes people prefer it that way. Mrs. Grant started leaving the back door ajar in the afternoons so the house could think. Stale air makes for stale arguments, she said. We wiped down counters that didn't need wiping and polished picture frames that never asked to shine. Small work steadies big fear. In the evenings I sat with the photograph and the ring and the letter. I read one paragraph at a time and then walked the length of the hall as if the words were better understood in motion. When I reached the end, I turned around and tried again. The line about David tell him, being there counted, felt like a door I didn't want to open then, like a window I needed. When Mrs. Grant first came to work for us, I was 10 and David was 8. Mum had just started the kind of tired that doesn't go away with sleep. Mrs. Grant showed up in a navy coat and sensible shoes and took control of our kitchen the way generals take hills. She taught us how to fold towels properly thirds then in half and how to stack plates without making the cupboard flinch. One afternoon she set 2 bowls of soup in front of us and said, "You can be on the same team or you can be hungry. Choose." We ate. We chose. Later, when the choosing got harder, I remembered the soup and how quickly a house can lose its patience. The summer after Mom died, Dad made us paint the fence. He said the wood needed protection, and so did we. David lasted an hour, maybe 2. He drifted to the shade, pulled out his phone, scrolled like the answer might be in his thumb. I kept painting, not because I liked it, but because the fence was honest about what it needed. At dusk, Dad walked the line, ran his palm along the dry boards, nodded once and said, "Looks good, boys." David grinned and slapped my shoulder and said teamwork like he had invented the word. I said nothing. Sometimes silence is the only way to keep a small piece from breaking. Once in the fall, we both tried out for the same baseball position. Dad watched from the bleachers, hands in his pockets, face unreadable. David made the team. I didn't. On the drive home, Dad said, "Proud of you," and the sentence broke cleanly into 2 pieces in the car, one for each of us. David turned on the radio. I rolled down the window. We let the air do the rest. Mr. Harris called the night before the second hearing. His voice sounded like coffee left on the warmer too long. "I'll argue what the evidence allows," he said. "I won't promise what it can't deliver. I know," I said. Silence. Then a sigh that seemed to come from under a stack of files. "Your father wrote me a separate note," he added. "It wasn't for court. It was for me. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. Some sentences are bridges, some are fences. We left that one standing. I slept in short, careful pieces. Dreamed of the creek and the watch and the steering wheel under my white-knuckled hands. In the dream, Dad sat in the passenger seat and pointed at the horizon and said, "Loosen up." I woke with my fingers aching and laughed at myself in the dark. After the ruling, we didn't celebrate. We performed the rituals of relief, coffee, deep breaths, windows, open the quiet list of things that could finally be done, out loud. I called the utility companies and said my father's name the way you say a password for the last time. I set his mail in a stack under the photograph and promised myself I would open it when I felt generous, and not a minute sooner. Aunt Claire sent a text the next morning. "Family, ich lunch." I stared at the 3 dots that never turned into more words and set the phone face down. At noon, she appeared anyway, a bowl of potato salad in one hand and persistence in the other. "You can't let this be the end of the story," she said. "It's a chapter," I answered. "Chapters need transition," she said. "Then write yours," I said, and surprised us both with how tired I sounded. In the afternoon, I took the pruning shears to the yard. The hydrangeas had overreached blue and beautiful and a little arrogant. I trimmed what blocked the gate and left what leaned toward the light. When I was finished, I found an old garden stake under the leaves, a thin piece of wood with my mother's faded handwriting, north bedshade tolerant. I wiped the dirt away with my thumb and felt something like a permission slip arrive in my chest. Inside, I fixed the step that had always confessed your weight. 2 nails, a shim, a test bounce. The groan softened. The house sounded less haunted and more honest. That night, David texted, "Can I pick up a few of Dad's things?" I answered yes. "I'll set them aside. Come tomorrow." He arrived with a cardboard box and a look I hadn't seen since we were boys, the one that meant he was bracing for a hit that might not come. We stood in the living room with the shades open, daylight doing what it could. "I'll take the old fishing reel," he said, and the cufflinks he wore to the last parent-teacher night. I fetched them from the study drawer, the one that smelled like cedar and pencil shavings. He turned the reel in his hands and smiled without showing his teeth. "Remember the lake?" he asked. I did. "The fog, the dock, the way Dad let us make terrible knots until we learned how to make better ones. We both hooked sunfish that day. Dad pretended it was a miracle. For once we believed him." "I shouldn't have pushed the deed," David said, not looking up. I kept thinking of those nights, the meds, the calls, the appointments. I wanted something to make it mean more than it did. "It did mean more," I said. "It meant exactly what it meant. It just didn't mean the house." He nodded slowly, like a man finally hearing the score of a song he'd been humming wrong. "I don't know how to be your brother," he said. A terrible, honest sentence. "We'll learn." I said a sentence that only sounded easy. He left with the box. I stood at the window until his car turned the corner. Then I went back to the desk, took out the letter, and read the last paragraph again, the part about doing no harm before forgiveness was ready. It felt less like an order and more like a way to keep the floor under both of us. Spring slid into the edges of the yard. Birds tested their voices in the gutter. Neighbors waved a little longer than they had in winter. Mrs. Grant brought a stack of linen napkins from her attic and said a house should have small luxuries. They remind you to be human. We ironed them at the kitchen table, steam lifting fabric smoothing under our palms. I sorted the boxes in the back room. Maps, receipts, programs from school. Plays a shoebox of letters from my mother to my father that I didn't read because some love deserves to stay between the people who made it. At the bottom of the box, I found a typed sheet with Dad's edits in blue ink, a list for a road trip he never took. Thermos, windshield fluid, spare fuses, good songs, snacks we won't regret later. Underneath, in the margin, one more line. Ask boys if they want to come. Say please. He had circled please twice. I put the list on the fridge. I don't know if I'll ever take that trip, but it steadies me to know the car was pointed at a horizon. On a Thursday, the neighbor from 2 doors down, Mr. O'Rourke, with the enthusiastic lawnmower, stopped by with a pie he'd bought and tried to pass off as homemade. We stood in the yard and made small talk about weather and taxes and the right time to reseed. He glanced at the house and said, "Your father taught me how to tie a bowline knot, said every man should know how to make a loop that holds when it matters and falls apart when it doesn't." He smiled at his shoes. Doesn't seem like a big legacy until you need it. He left the pie on the porch and walked home, whistling a tune I couldn't place. That night I took the ring off and set it on the desk, then put it back on again. I don't know if jewelry holds memory or just gives your hands something to do while your heart catches up. Either way, it helped. I wrote a letter to David I didn't send. I wrote, "There are things I want to blame you for, and some of them you deserve." I wrote, "There are things I want to forgive, and some of them I already have." I wrote, "I don't know how to be your brother either, but I'm willing to learn." I folded the letter and put it in the same drawer as the photograph. Maybe someday. Weeks later, the courthouse mailed certified copies of the final order. I signed for them on the porch pen, scratching against cheap cardboard, and thought about the weight we give paper. Inside, I slid one copy into a folder labeled House, a word that felt both bigger and smaller than it used to. I put the other copy behind the photograph, a talisman I didn't believe in and needed anyway. Mrs. Grant and I ate dinner at the kitchen table with the window open and the radio low. A baseball game murmured from some other home, some other kitchen. Between innings, the broadcaster went quiet, and we listened to the long breath of a town that had decided to keep going. "Your father would be pleased," she said. "Not about the fight. About the way you're letting the house be a house." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means you're not turning it into a courtroom," she said. "You're turning it back into a place where tea boils and windows open and people remember to take off their shoes." After she left, I swept the kitchen floor like a man trying to erase a set of footprints he'd made on purpose. It looked the same when I was done. That was the point. I keep the letter in the desktop drawer, right-hand side. Sometimes I read only the first line, sometimes the last, sometimes the middle, where he admits he waited too long. Every time I hear the same chord, regret, love instruction, and every time it lands a little differently, like the same song in a different room. Hold what's yours without gripping. I practice on the steering wheel, on the pruning shears, on the handle of the kettle when it's time to pour. I practice on the memories that make me wince and on the ones that make me smile. Some nights when the sky is busy with weather and the hydrangeas tap the glass like polite visitors, I sit in the armchair by the window and tell the house out loud what I plan to do tomorrow: paint the porch, oil the hinges, call David. Sometimes I do all three, sometimes I do one, sometimes I do none, and try again the next day. The clock ticks, the kettle sings. The door opens and closes. The house breathes. So do I, if you're reading this. If anyone ever does, I hope you can hear what I finally learned. A house is just weather with walls until we choose each other again and again. That's the will I live by now. Not ink, not stamps, not witnesses with neat signatures, but the daily bequest of presence, of patience, of a steady hand on your shoulder when you step off the curb and into whatever comes next.